Pest House, Beckley Farm, British Columbia. The shortest history of any haunted house in North America may very well have been that of Beckley Farm. Built in the late 1860s or very early 1870s, the records are unclear, between Dallas Road along Victoria's waterfront and the shore. Within just a few years, it had been demolished, but not before it brought death and misfortune to many who lived there, and the belief among Victorians that its unhappy dead wandered the premises. George E. Nias erected the house, a horse stable, and other outbuildings that he called Beckley Farm. Nias never lived there. For some reason, he moved to Australia, and Beckley Farm was abandoned. The real story of Beckley Farm begins in 1871, when a smallpox epidemic aboard the ship Prince Alfred brought renewed attention to it. The vessel traveled among San Francisco, Victoria, and then Nanaimo. During a stop in Victoria, 7 passengers were found to have the dreaded disease. A decision was quickly made that the infected people would be sent to Beckley Farm to live in isolation. The house was hurriedly repaired, and a yellow flag was put up to give notice that the farm was now a pest house. The Prince Alfred continued on its route to Nanaimo, further up Vancouver Island on the Strait of Georgia, and then back down to Victoria. A crewman was diagnosed with smallpox at the second Victoria stop, and he too was sent to Beckley Farm. One of the original 7 passengers, a teenager named Bertha Whitney, died on June 23, 1872. The sailor from the Prince Alfred also succumbed to the disease. Both were buried on the grounds of Beckley Farm. The 2 deaths were responsible for the first rumors that Beckley Farm was unlucky, even though the 6 other passengers from the ship fully recovered. Once they got well and left, the farm was again abandoned. A few months later, a stranger who gave his name as P. Lackle of San Francisco checked into Victoria's Old Angel Hotel. He stayed to himself for several weeks, but then revealed to the hotel manager that his wife would soon be arriving from England and they would need some place to live. The manager suggested he look into the old pest house, Beckley Farm. That he did. For several days, he was seen wandering around the property, taking notes on what was presumably would be the repairs needed to make the house habitable. Then one morning, quite a strange incident was reported. A tenant at the Angel Hotel happened to be walking near Beckley Farm. As he neared the house, he noticed a man known as Lackle and a woman engaged in a heated argument. The woman suddenly struck Lackle and fled. Nobody reported seeing her again. The man who called himself P. Lackey was found dead of a self-inflicted bullet wound on February 17, 1873, in a Beckley Farm stable. His last name was actually Stalker, and he was from Scotland. No one could find out what his real business in Victoria had been, nor why he had assumed a false identity. Since the woman who struck him had vanished, the speculation was that he had murdered her and then killed himself. 4 deaths were now tied to Beckley Farm. Victorians started reporting weird things at the place, lights glimpsed in some of the old buildings, and a woman's dreadful screams. The haunting did not last long. The buildings mysteriously burned down in late 1873. A cause was not found, although it was presumed the lights people saw were somehow responsible. There is a final tragic footnote to the saga of Beckley Farm. A woman who had been one of the original passengers quarantined at Beckley Farm and who survived the ordeal had settled in New Westminster. Once, as she was sorting through her clothing, she came upon a dress she had owned for many years. She sent it to a dressmaker for alterations. Within days, the dressmaker and several assistants became very ill and died. A doctor diagnosed the deaths as smallpox and speculated that the pox virus had been transmitted through the dress. Any physical evidence that Beckley Farm ever existed has long since vanished and been forgotten. There is no sentimentality for such a cursed existence. Museum Spectres, Toronto, Ontario. On Queen's Park Crescent, the Royal Ontario Museum may have 2 old ghosts as part of its impressive collection. The better known of the pair may be the ghost of the museum's former director, Dr. Charles Curley, who was 82 when he died in 1957. He was director of the museum for 32 years, from 1914 until his retirement in 1946. Dr. Curley isn't a frightening specter at all, just particularly dressed. He wears a nightshirt and a cap as he scurries down the corridor. Precisely why he is dressed this way or the reason for his haste is not known. A little curly-haired blonde girl of about 8 was seen in the planetarium section of the museum in the late 1970s. She wore a starched white dress and looked very unhappy, according to one museum staff member. Unfortunately, as with many ghosts, no one knew her name or the nature of her distress. Isle of Skye, Holyrood, Newfoundland and Labrador. This small community of 2,000 people on the south end of Conception Bay has an ancient connection to the sea and seafaring ways. Back in the 1860s, John Mackay and his stepfather John Cunningham had a big fishing business in the village, in what he called the north arm of Holyrood. Mackay's schooner was the 70-ton Isle of Skye, a fore and after. In early October 1865, Mackay, Cunningham, and their crew had a full catch from the Labrador banks and made for home. They were last seen on the night of October 10th crossing Notre Dame Bay, northwest of Fogo. There was frightful nor'easter early the next day, and the Isle of Skye was lost, a curious incident on the night of October 11th. However, led some Holyrood residents to think Mackay and Cunningham had weathered the storm. At about 10 o'clock that night, people living along the seashore on the south side, west of Runaway Rock, heard loud cries and shouts of "Hello! Breakers ahead!" coming from across the water. Men jumped into their boats and rowed out into the bay to help what they thought was a ship in distress. Bonfires were lit on shore to guide the stricken craft. Though the search went on for hours, no sign of a ship was ever found. The shouts had died away, and the rescuers went home puzzled and afraid. Shortly after retiring for that same night, Dennis Penny, who lived along the coast near North Arm, heard the splash and dropping chain of an anchor. His son had been aboard the Isle of Skye. Penny was certain the schooner had returned. He got up to light the fire, fully expecting his boy to walk through the door soon. It didn't happen. Sometime later, wreckage of the Isle of the Skye was found at Moulton's Harbour Head, near Twillingate on the northeast coast, several hundred kilometers from Holyrood. Many believe Mackay and Cunningham attempted to make it home in spirit, if not in the flesh. The Raven, Nevermore. This was somewhere off the coast of Haiti. Men and women of the sea know better than to ignore maritime superstitions. No other group may have as many omens, premonitions, or warnings of impending doom as do those who make their living upon the world's oceans. There are at least two superstitions that should not be disregarded if one is to travel safely across the seas. For to do so is to risk facing the same fate as the Raven, a yacht manned by Canadian sailors that was wrecked on a Caribbean reef decades ago. The ketch was under two oppressive shrouds. Its name had been changed from the original Danebrogue at its launch to the Raven, and, worse still, the name was now that of a bird. Why sailors avoid those taboos? But there was more to the Raven's problems than her transgression of seafaring superstitions. The ghost of her original builder prowled the decks. The ship, then called Danebrogue, was under construction in Denmark in 1921 when the builder fell to his death from the dock. It is not clear if there was an investigation, and neither is it certain whether the death was simply an accident. From 1921 to 1972, the year the ship was wrecked on a Caribbean reef, the second of the Danebrogue is unknown. But in the early 70s, Jane de Groot, head of the Vancouver Sailing Academy, set out to bring the Danish ship to British Columbia from Nassau. He offered Vancouver sailing students the opportunity to serve as crew for $1,000, including airfare to Nassau. They would assist de Groot on the long voyage to British Columbia. But when the sailing students, de Groot, his wife, and 24-year-old Joan Whitley arrived in Nassau, the group found a serious problem on board the now renamed Raven. The American crewmen who had steered the ship from Denmark to the Bahamas said the ship was cursed. Accidents plagued the yacht during the transatlantic voyage. Footsteps clattered across the decks when no one should have been there, and worst of all, the ship had almost sunk in the Bay of Biscay. Some crew members whispered that they had even seen the ghost of the dead builder. Not one of them volunteered to stay aboard to Vancouver. So de Groot and his 22-member crew left Nassau under Dutch Captain Bert Mooy. The plan was to briefly dock in Haiti and contravene the superstition about the boat's name by changing it back to the Danebrogue. But since the captain was Dutch, the change had to be made and the Netherlands governed port. De Groot decided to leave Haiti for Jamaica and then sail on to the port of Curaçao in the Netherlands Antilles. Shortly after leaving Port-au-Prince, however, the curse of the Raven became visible. Joan Whitley was sleeping below deck shortly before her 4 a.m. watch began when something awakened her. I was in my cabin trying to get some sleep. Suddenly I felt a creepy feeling, and when I looked up, there was a man in blue standing there. She later reported. He appeared to be ordering crew about and waving his arms in the air. The ghost was middle-aged, dressed in clothing of the 1920s. Whitley thought it was the ghost of the ship's builder. 4 hours after, the Raven struck a reef near Haiti. Whitley then had her second brush with the supernatural as she sat in the wheelhouse with de Groot's wife, Elsie. We were firmly stuck on the reef and in no danger of sinking. I felt this clammy and creepy feeling again. Tears started to come from my eyes, and I felt the ghost leave the ship. Joan Whitley believed there was nothing that could have been done to save that ship. The Raven was jinxed from the moment the builder was killed. It was just a matter of time.